So our students who aren't able to make it now, because we have another brown bag going on at the same time, they can come see this one as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to Leigh, and thanks for coming, Leigh. Appreciate it.
No problem. Hi, my name is Leigh Lawhon. So yeah, I'm a UX designer and a full stack developer. I have about 20 years of design under my belt, and I'm one of the lucky people who actually gets to do both design and development. That can be a little bit rare. But today I'm going to teach you about some basic design. And even though you may not be the designer on the project, or there may be, a whole group of designers on the project, it's important to understand how to create what's called a visual hierarchy, because it's crucial to successful wireframes and just general presentations in general. It's, in fact, basic design is important for almost any application. So without further ado, let's get started. So one of the fundamental things you should know about design is that your brain is lazy. It wants the path of least resistance. It wants the fewest words, the least clicks, the simplest answers. So your brain just really doesn't want to think. It likes abstractions and symbols that can quickly be understood. And when as an example of this, when you first learn how to read, you used to break down the individual letters and sounds. So you would say something like k, a, t when you were reading. And one day your brain started to see the shapes of the word cat and stopped reading, pardon me, speaking of cats. One day you started seeing the shape of the word cat and stopped reading the letters k, a, t, and that became cat. Your brain remembered the pattern and it took a shortcut. And so because of that, you can still read something like this, even though you may have to read it really slowly. You're still seeing the shapes of the letters, or the shapes of the words rather than the individual letters. And it's also why you can understand what these symbols might mean without ever seeing them before. So let's take something super simple like the last one, the sun and day. So the circle represents the sun, and you could imagine the second one would possibly be a symbol for noon, since that's when the sun's the highest in the sky. The next one might be morning, as the sun's rising, and the fourth one should be something like evening. And the final one would be something like midnight, when the sun is at its lowest point. So you could look through some of those. And so you can still understand these because your brain has learned some shortcuts and patterns it uses to understand something it's never seen before. So you might say something down the road about design like, I don't know why, but I like it. And really what you're saying is that this design satisfies some pattern in my brain, or I recognize something in this. Maybe it's a piece of artwork or a poem. You recognize something in that element. You understand it without really ever seeing it before. So how do we use these learned patterns to create good design? By the end of this lesson, you'll learn 6 basic shortcuts or patterns that your brain looks for and pays attention to. And we're going to use that to design a page, a website page. But you can use these concepts, like I said, to design interfaces, to design wireframes, or even a presentation to a client. The 6 elements of design that we're going to be looking at, there are actually more, but we're just going to look at 6, are distance, balance, weight, direction and dimension, value and contrast, and then finally we'll look at color. But first, let's play a guessing game. So this is a magazine layout that's written in Japanese, I believe. And by looking at this, think about where perhaps the title might be on this page. Where does maybe the body of the article start? Or is this article about perhaps a chef, or is it about just food? And if you think about those things, try and think about how you know those things. So for me, I would guess that the upper right-hand corner is the title because it's the largest text on the page. It's also on the top of the page. I'd guess that the article would start in the lower right-hand side because it's got a drop cap. And I'd guess that it's probably about a chef rather than food because the largest image, the heaviest image on the page is about a kitchen. It's a picture of a kitchen, and it's directly next to a picture of a man who's cooking. So I think the article is actually about the man rather than the food he cooks. So we know all of these things without ever being able to read the actual language. So what gets your brain's attention? How do we know these things without really seeing them or being told them? Let's look at the 6 basic elements. The first element is the closest object or distance. So if you look at this, which of these objects is in front? And how do you know it? Well, for me, the largest object is probably the closest one, followed by the second largest, which also has a bit of overlap, which would indicate to me that the middle circle is in front of the smaller circle. So why would this get your brain's attention? Well, first of all, if a lion is far away, it's a lot less threatening than if it's right up next to you. So things that are closer to you are definitely more interesting to your brain than something that's further away and safer at a safer distance. The next element of design is odd numbers and unbalanced. So these are just some simple shapes, but why is the one on the right more exciting than the one on the left? Well, what would happen if they were bricks? If they were bricks, the one on the right might fall over and land on your foot. So there's a little bit of danger there. So your brain is more interested in objects that have the potential to cause danger. And also it likes odd numbers, or at least it's interested in odd numbers because your brain is always looking to fill in gaps. So your brain might be a little, it might have grabbed its attention because the object on the right needs another brick to make it more stable. The next element of design would be biggest and heaviest things that are high on the page. So it's weight and position on the page. So of these objects, you could probably guess that the one on the top is the heavier object and it gains more attention. So again, if this were a boulder, you'd be more concerned if it were high up on a cliff than if it were just a little pebble. So things that are higher on the page and larger tend to get your attention a little bit more. The next thing that gets your attention would be dimensions, curves, and patterns. So here I've just used simple shapes to create a 3-dimensional space on the first one. The second one has energy. It's kind of a curve and a wave. And the final one is a pattern, and it could be, let's say, bars on a window. But all of these elements tend to attract your brain in terms of hierarchy. And again, the one on the right, your brain fills in the blanks, and it kind of likes that type of puzzle. So when things are missing, your brain wants to fill them in. The 5th element is value and contrast. So in addition to shapes, high contrast will get your brain's attention. So you'll see that in the upper left-hand corner where the clouds meet the sky, there's a lot of contrast. So a very light color hitting a very dark color. And also there's a high contrast where the snow is on the mountains. And those areas attract our brain a lot more than low contrast areas like the clouds in the middle where they're just kind of a gray mass. So high contrast is also really important when you're designing something because obviously you can't read a low contrast text on a background. So that doesn't mean it has to be boring, but contrast is super important to have a dark text on a lighter background or vice versa. So you'll see there at the bottom on the right, the checked items do have some color and they have some interest, but they still retain the high contrast. On the left, the contrast is really hard to read, especially with small text. And the one there on the left middle has red text on a green background, which not only does it have low contrast, you're dealing with complementary colors, which tend to vibrate visually and really bother your eye. So it's not a good idea. So that's contrast. The last one is probably the trickiest one. So you can get the brain's attention using color. And color is color is really kind of a fun thing to play with. I know when I was a kid, I wanted to use all the colors in the coloring box. But as it turns out, when I went to art school, I learned that colors can create, if you use a lot of color, it can create a lot of noise and distraction. So like the other elements that we've discussed, you want to kind of restrict your use of these attention-getting elements to just a few areas on the page. And to be honest, using color correctly can be a little bit difficult. So I often cheat. It's not a bad thing to cheat with color. So you'll see on the left-hand side of this screen, there are a couple of websites you can actually go to get some really nice color schemes. Color Lovers is one, and notice it's the British spelling of color. So if you're looking for that. And then color.adobe.com. Both of these have really nice palettes that are put together with people who are really focused on color and really good at color. Like I said, color can be one of the hardest things about doing design. And typically, when you're doing wireframes and presenting UX to a client, you really want to stay away from color until the very end, because people really have an emotional attachment to color. And it can really sidetrack a meeting. So I tend to keep color off the page until the very end. But if you wanted to try your hand at creating your own color palette, I have a little kind of formula over here on the right-hand side. When artists create a color palette, they actually pick shapes on the color wheel, and those shapes kind of establish their color palette. So the very first one at the top there is complementary colors, which you probably learned in school. It's the color opposite on the color wheel, and that's pretty easy. The next one is analogous colors, and analogous colors, you would pick a color and you would choose the color to its direct right and to its direct left. You would then, the third one is a split complementary. So instead of just picking the color directly across from it, you're picking the colors to the right and the left. And you'll see in just a little bit a design I did using a split complementary. And then finally, there's a triadic color shape, which has 3 equidistant colors on the color wheel. There's a few more color shapes, but these are just some basic ones. And the really important thing to remember, though, when you restrict down your palette, you're not just restricted to those colors. So you'll see on the far right of that slide, if I choose that green, I don't just have to use that green. I can lighten the green, I can darken the green, I can desaturate the green a little bit. So there's all sorts of things you can do within that color to expand your palette. So that's if you want to do your own custom palette. You can always go to these sites and take a look at what other people have done with color palettes. So those are the 6 elements of design we're going to look at today. Sorry, little spring hay fever. So what are we going to do with these 6 elements of design? We're going to actually use them to create a visual, what's called a visual hierarchy. So with design, we take our content. So if we're going to design a page or an interface, we take our content and pick a few elements that should be the most important. We want to find the most important elements, the second most important elements, and then the third. Usually you don't go past 3 levels. You can go to a 4th level sometimes, but remember, your brain is lazy, and it really wants to kind of keep things to a minimum. So again, this is known as a visual hierarchy. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So first, a visual hierarchy is very similar to when you were in school and had to take notes as an outline. Again, you'd pick the most important element, the second most important, and the third, and so on. And we want to use this concept to design a balance where the most important things get attention and the least important things kind of become background. So this is an image that has a strong visual hierarchy. Notice the use of color and contrast. So Martha Stewart there has a blue sweater and she's sitting next to a bowl of yellow lemons. And this is really the only color that's used in the entire image. You'll see there there's the floor as well that has some color, but notice the shape of the floor. Martha Stewart's literally sitting on an arrow that's pointing at us. The whole image is very welcoming and inviting. And also notice the background and how subdued and grayed out everything is. All of this is done intentionally to really highlight the most important part of the image. So when you're in the grocery store or you're walking down the street and you notice a photograph or a magazine cover, try and look for the elements of design that they're using to emphasize the main point to the photograph or the design. So, again, we've been talking about all the things that get the brain's attention, but note that the things that aren't getting the brain's attention are just as important because they kind of frame the elements that are important. So what happens when you don't have a visual hierarchy? Well, visual hierarchy fails when elements of composition fight for attention. So this is obviously a terrible design, and so is this. You don't want to be this guy. Don't design something that is constantly asking for attention and it's constantly fighting. This absolutely has no center of interest whatsoever. On the other hand, this is a design I did for an interface for an afternoon of presentations. And I used the language of design to show the viewers kind of what was the most important thing on this screen. And as you can see, at the very top are some graphs. And I'm using the fact that it's a circular shape rather than a square where there's squares everywhere else. I'm using high contrast. So it's that dark green on a white background. I'm also using some energetic waves. And I'm also using the red color specifically in that area to let the viewer know that that's the most important thing that they want to look at. So looking at this, the other thing I did was I used a restricted palette. So this goes back to the color conversation. In this example, I used a split complementary. So you can imagine I'm using kind of a blue-green color, and the opposite would be kind of a reddish-orange. And so the colors on either side of it would be red and would be like a yellow color. So it's a little bit shifted, but it's basically a split complementary. With the yellow, I desaturated and lightened the yellow. The blue-green I kind of played around with and did a little bit of a dance between blue and green to highlight the greens. But I specifically am only using the red, the most attention-getting color, for the text that's the most important. So let's take a look at the assignment we're going to do today. We're going to use these elements to build a web page. I'm going to design a web page for you really quickly, and I will have a limited screen, so I won't be able to do too much design. But I challenge you to take this exercise and do it for a web portfolio. So because it's a great thing to have to show people. But the website I'm going to use is CSS Zen Garden. And if you've never seen this before, it's simply a site where it has some HTML and CSS. And hundreds of people have gone in and taken that one page and designed it in many different ways. So one of the things you could do is go to this page and just look at the different elements people have used to highlight or emphasize parts of the page. And you could critique them. There's some pages that are better than others, and perhaps maybe you want to redesign somebody's design. There's some really good ones though on there. So we're going to take that text and we're going to follow some steps. So we're going to pick a theme and a background. Again, with the images that we're going to choose some that are more attractive to the brain and some that are less subdued so that we can kind of balance out our graphics. We're then going to pick kind of the first, second, and third elements of the HTML and decide where we want to put those. And then we're going to use the elements of design to build a visual hierarchy. Finally, if you do this assignment, I'd love for you guys to get back together and assess each other's design. This doesn't necessarily mean critique, but basically point out for each other what elements of design you see in each other's designs and maybe make some suggestions as to where you might improve it. So with that said, I'm going to start my design. The first thing I'm going to do is pick a theme, and I'm going to pick the theme of Easter just because it's coming up. And I just went out on the internet and picked up a couple of images, very few images for this small page that I might use to design my CSS Zen Garden page. So you'll notice I have two pictures of eggs here. There's one that's square, and there's three that are kind of oval shaped. So the oval shape is very interesting to the brain, and the square shape tends to be very static. So if I have to choose between two different images that I might work with to design, and I know that the Easter egg is kind of my most important element, I'd probably choose the Easter eggs that are round on a white background rather than the square picture, because the square picture is very flat. By emphasizing the Easter egg, we suddenly know, without being told, we suddenly know that this is a website about Easter rather than perhaps, let's say, a website about lawn care or birds' eggs. So we really want to emphasize the theme of our page here. So what I'll do is when I get to designing, I'll get rid of the square Easter egg image because I don't want to use it. It's too flat. So, all right, so those are my, basically some design elements that I picked up. I'll come back to this page in a minute. And then next, this is the wall of text that I get from CSS Zen Garden. These are all the elements that should be on the page. And I'm going to pick and choose some that I think are interesting. So one of the things and keep in mind, you're the designer. You can emphasize anything on the page. If you go through the CSS Zen Garden gallery, you'll see that different people have picked different elements to emphasize. You don't have to emphasize the very first set of text. You can jump around and you can move things around. So that's kind of the fun part of design. So for me, what I'd really like to do is, and I'm not going to use all this text because I can't fit it on a slide, but I'm going to use just the second paragraph, the road to enlightenment, because I think that really captures what you're doing here. I'll go ahead and use the so what is this about? And I'll also use the benefits. I'll pick those three elements. And you'll see in just a minute, I'm going to pick and choose which one has an H1 and which one has an H2 to establish a visual structure. Before we get started, let's take one more look at a way for people to design, or kind of a cheat sheet for designers. So I'm sure you've probably seen a grid system if you've done any kind of responsive design, but designers have been using grid systems for years, for hundreds of years. How old is design? I'm sure. We'll go back to the cavemen. But grids help designers and artists establish a visual structure. So you'll probably be familiar with columns when it comes to grids, but also we use rows a lot in design. And so you'll see the grid system up there on the left is broken down into both columns and rows. And a lot of times what magazine designers or artists, or, you know, if you're going to do a painting or anything, they'll break down a page into a grid, and they won't fill in every square. What they'll do is fill in big portions of the square and leave areas that are blank for white space, and use smaller portions of the square. This creates a nice ratio of big to small. You don't want to create something big on a page and then kind of big and then kind of bigger. You really want to have a distinct contrast between the sizes. There's actually a thing called the golden ratio, which is a specific ratio that's pleasant to the eye. We won't get, that's a more advanced graphic design topic, but you'll notice the web page on the right-hand side, it not only uses a grid, it actually shows you the grid as part of the design. You'll see that the robot there is about 8 blocks. It's about 2 blocks wide and 4 blocks tall. Each one of the navigation menus is broken out into a block. And then the title of the page is about 2 blocks long. So it has a nice balance of shapes and white space, and it definitely falls into the grid. So it makes your brain happy to see something on a grid. If you've been designing as long as I have, I actually formally don't use a grid anymore. It's just ingrained in my brain, and you'll see me in this next exercise just placing things. I'll try and use some guides, but I've been doing this a while, so I kind of have grids in my head. The next thing is to know is that good typography has a bit of contrast. So this is kind of obvious, but if you squint down your eyes, you can see that the typography itself has good contrast. The headers would be like a black, if you were squint, would be like a dark block, whereas some of the smaller text might be a lighter gray. So you can have contrast and value in your typography. So, whoops, I don't want to cheat. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to get out of my presentation. And let's do, well, I'll leave the comments up there. I'll just make them smaller. Okay. So like I said, I'm going to get rid of that. That's not something I'm interested in. But let's go ahead and design this page. So I really like the grass, and I'm going to use the grass for my background. However, that grass is really kind of big and dark, so I might want to subdue it down just a little bit. So when you have a background, it's a very good idea to use something that has low contrast. And if you're going to use something that's as patterned as this, try and be sparing with the amount that you show. So for instance, the first thing I would want to do here is add a white. Move this over so I can see. Oops, wrong one. Sorry, let me get my whole thing here. There we go. I'd want a white block here. And let me move this. Let's try that again. White. Well, not sure why. Huh. Well, that shape is not changing color. And it thinks it's text. Well, I'm going to cheat for just a second and jump ahead to the finished product, which is why I have the finished product, just in case I do have to cheat. So I might put something like a white square with transparency over the top of this so that it subdues the green of the grass, so that it doesn't take up too much attention. The other thing reason I would put a white background is because it would be difficult to read text on this grass. And so I want to separate, I still want to keep some of that texture because it's interesting, but I do want to kind of cut back on it. So now that we have our background and we've subdued it a little bit, I might start laying in a grid. So I'm just going to eyeball this grid. So I'm going to put in, it's going to be 3 columns. And that gives me a nice break. So I might have something that's 2 columns wide and one that's 1 column wide. Okay. And let's just do this. And so now that I have a block here, I might want to subdivide my, there we go, subdivide the area even more and fill in, let's just borrow this, and fill in a section on the right-hand side. So here I'm using that grid system that we saw before. And let's change, now it's working. Let's change this to 100%. So slowly but surely, I'm breaking down my area. And now that I have that, this is a nice spot to put my text for the name of the website. So I'll put it up here and call it CSS. Oops. CSS. Suddenly this PowerPoint presentation is not working. CSS, there we go. Zen Garden. And I want high contrast here, so I'm going to pick a nice yellow color. One thing you'll notice is that, there we go. I'm going to pick a nice yellow color, probably a little bit lighter. One thing that you'll notice, try that one more time. There we go. There we go. Nice yellow color. Okay. One thing you'll notice is, again, I'm picking a restricted palette. I've got greens and blues, it's very much analogous. So I'll use even a yellow color to, so I have a lot of room here to play around with color, but I don't have to go crazy and use every crayon in the box. So I'm gonna make this something like probably 40, something big. And let's make it heavier. And how about even bigger? There we go. Now, because there's a pattern here, I definitely want to use a drop shadow. That's another thing. Most people think you just use a drop shadow for anything, or for everything. And you do use them a lot, but a lot of times the reason why you want to use them is because they will separate your background from your text. So if I add a drop shadow here, it adds contrast to my text. So it makes it darker underneath. And the next thing, how am I doing on time? Okay. Then I'm just gonna grab some text here. We'll speed this up a little bit. And there we go. Now, this is going to be the main text that I want to show. So I'm going to do a couple of things here. First thing I can do, come on, there we go. First thing I can do is make, obviously, the header really large. So let's bump that up to something like 30. But also, too, I might want to change the color. So I'm going to use something simple here, like this blue. But this is the main text that I want people to read. So larger and more spaced out text is a lot easier for your brain to read. So it'll read it first. That's why magazines put intro text in large font size and really kind of space it out. So I'm going to up that, not to 24. That's too big. Let's go with 18. There we go. And let's make this a little wider. The next thing I'm going to do is, and I'm going to cheat a little bit so I don't have to go into the website. I want to showcase these web pages because that's the entire point of the site. And I might move these eggs down a little bit so that they create a nice little shape that has interest and is rounded. I might even turn some of these a little bit so that I might turn some of these a little bit so that, let's go with 35, so that it actually creates kind of a little bit of an angle heading to the edge of the page. That is too much. Let's go with 20. There we go. Something like that. Finally, I'm going to get some additional text here. So what's this about? And, oops, wrong one. I'll go ahead and add that text. There we go. Now this is going to be my body copy, so I don't want it as large as the other one. So that's actually right about the right size. And let's make this 2 columns to break it up. Now I'm gonna cheat here a little bit and pretend that there's a break here, because I'm running out of time, but you could use a wrap here to wrap the text. Finally, let's move this over. Finally, last bit of text I'm going to grab are the benefits, and I'm just gonna grab the text. I don't want even, I just wanna keep it simple. I don't even wanna take that header. And there we go. Now something like this, I would kind of come back in and I'd want to put a little bit more color into the overall design. So we've used our limited color palette, and but maybe there's a couple of spots where I want to hit it with some orange. So how about I use just this orange over here. And because that's there, I'll go ahead and hit that with some orange as well. So it has just a little bit more interest in it. So I could play around with this design a little bit and get some more shapes in there. There's certainly room for improvement, but I'm gonna, excuse me, I'm gonna jump ahead and take a look at this guy here, which is the final, this is kind of the final composition that I did in about 5 minutes. It really wasn't a lot of design, but you can see how I'm using some of the elements of design to show some of the, highlight some of the most important areas here. Because I'm using a restricted palette with the blues and the greens and the mutated colors, I can really emphasize the thumbnails over here on the right-hand side. So your task, if you choose to do so, would be to go ahead, pull down the HTML and CSS from the CSS Zen Garden site, and follow these, using these 6 elements of design, design a visual hierarchy on the page that emphasizes 1 or 2 elements. And then, like I said, once you have a design, first of all, feel free to publish it on CSS Zen Garden. That's always a great thing to point to when you're in an interview. But also get together with your colleagues and kind of go back and forth and see if you can find some areas to improve the energy and the attention, the focus of the piece. So it gets a little bit more attention in one area and maybe subdued in another area. Finally, I just want to point out, if you're interested in learning more about design basics, this is one of my all-time favorite books. I use it all the time when I teach design. It's a book called Design Basic Index by Jim Krause. It's a very easy to understand, small little snippets of design information, and there's all sorts of great little tidbits that you can learn in there. But also too, when you're designing a page and you're picking a theme, and by the way, a theme, like I did Easter, a theme could be anything. You could do a theme of, you know, your new favorite shoes or your pet snail. But sometimes too, when you can do a combination of the two and come up with some interesting themes. So your snail and your shoe. But if you're looking for more inspiration, there's a lot of sites out there like Zerb's Pattern Tap. You can go to the Webby Awards and take a look at some of the award-winning designs, or something like Logo Lounge, which has a lot of different little designs. Little logos can be really great inspiration for shapes. So, but that's it. That's what I have for you today. And yeah, hope you enjoyed it.
Awesome, Leigh. Thanks very much. We have time for some questions from folks. I don't see any questions posted yet in the questions thread. If there's anyone who would like to ask a question of Leigh, you can either post it in the questions thread, or we can, since we have a small enough group, we can have people unmute themselves. The questions thread is also in the Brown Bag channel. It's posted at 12:04, just so you know, in case you didn't see it. Did anyone have any questions?
Feel free to even ask me questions about coding.
Coding or any general UX questions, anything?
Yeah.
We'll let the awkward silence linger just a little bit. Here's a question, or someone just said it was very self-explanatory and well presented, so thank you. That was a comment from a student.
Excellent. I will say, you know, just one thing about my career has been very interesting. I know, so I'm pretty much I do a lot of full stack development these days, but I still do a ton of design. Right now I'm doing a UX project. It's interesting for both careers, both code and UX, to have a bit of a crossover. More often than not, I've gotten a job because, you know, like a coding job because I know some design, or a design job because I know some code. You don't always find a perfect mix of code and design in a job. Most people want you to stick to one or the other. But I've found a good job that allows me to do both, and it entertains me. But, you know, it's definitely something to do is to mix the two.
Awesome. And that's one of the things we're trying to do at Lambda School, is help introduce students, our UX students, to some development techniques. And
Awesome.
it's cool. All right, last call for questions. We'll just give it another minute of giving people a chance. And otherwise, Leigh, we really appreciate your presentation and introducing students to these concepts.
Great. All right, thank you.
So one question is, what's your favorite front-end framework?
Framework or library? I mean, so I'm a React. I love React. Right now I'm on a project that I'm doing Angular. I teach, a lot of times I'll teach jQuery, so I can't have a favorite. It's hard because the job typically demands that I have flexibility, but they all have their bonuses and subtractors. So
cool. One of the students commented that they're a tech person and appreciate your design input. So
oh, good. Yeah.
All right, I think we'll just wrap up now then. Again,
okay.
Thanks, Leigh, and I hope that you have a great day. We really appreciate your presentation.
Great, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks.